Welcome everyone, and tonight I want to talk a little bit about a small JRPG from my childhood that, for whatever reason, has stuck with me really well over the years. This is Illusion of Gaia. Now, the thing that was fun about this game was at least partly the point in my life where I came across it. My parents had just divorced, we had just moved towns, and the small town that I lived in before the video game rental place was really far away from my house, pretty inaccessible, at least to a kid that didn't have the ability to drive just yet. Now, interesting thing about where we moved to, there was a video rental place within walking distance of my house. And not only was it a new video rental place, but it was a giant one. This is one of these old mom and pop shops that had a ton of places to go in the store that had all sorts of different games. And even though the PlayStation and the N64 were the new things at the time, they hadn't discarded all their old stuff. So still having my Super Nintendo around, I definitely checked out their Super Nintendo section. And lo and behold, one of the games that they had was a little unusual title, Illusion of Gaia. Now, being kind of on the younger side at the time, the cover of it, which is the title screen, didn't really strike me as all that interesting at first, at least until I picked up the box. But we'll talk about what was on the back of the box a little bit later in the video. After a little bit of time, I did eventually end up giving the game a shot, and lo and behold, I got stuck at the part of the game that we're at right now because I wasn't paying that much attention to what was going on. And here in a minute, even though these guys tell you exactly what to do, number one, the game didn't really tell you any directions on what part of the controller did what you wanted them to do. And number two, I had no idea what it was talking about because this game kind of hints around at a few things here and there, but it doesn't really spell stuff out more than once. So there's not a massive ton of hand-holding. Now, obviously years later, there's not really a whole lot in this that's difficult to figure out. But at the time, I never did quite get past the initial part in Will's village here. But eventually I did figure out how to get past this part. Not necessarily my first rental, but being kind of stubborn and getting kind of curious about it because I kept remembering what I was seeing on the back of the box, I decided to give it another shot. And to be completely honest, eventually did end up playing it on an emulator too, because at that point in time, I didn't really have anything against emulation, which, small tangent, I still don't if you can't afford to play whatever it is that you're trying to play. So I have a lot of sympathy for, say, kids or people on lower income thresholds that use emulation to gain access to games that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. And I do think for the most part, people that quote-unquote pirate games are probably not going to be converted into paying customers by just making piracy harder to do. However, that being said, I do actually own this game now, and I own the means to play it. So even though I'm emulating it to make it easier to record on the computer, it's actually something that I have bought, and I have a physical copy of it now. So we can skip on past the emulation stuff. Back to the story. So after giving it a little bit of work, I finally got to this point. And it's not too terribly hard to figure out where to go from here. The interesting thing about Illusion of Gaia, though, is it actually unveils its story in a lot more organic manner than a lot of the RPGs from the time. You run into characters, they tell you some interesting details about what's going on. There's not a whole ton of exposition dumps in terms of just people saying stuff for no apparent reason, or at least in any way that doesn't fit their character. They tell you stories that are prompted, it fits in well, but it also manipulates the scenery to have you actually feel something and be involved in the story. The setup here is a little bit slow, but it's connecting you to all these characters. And for a good reason. You're going through, spending some time talking to his grandparents, you run into the little girl downstairs, and it turns out she is actually a princess. That's the whole reason why she just intruded in your house. She has no real sense of boundaries because to her there are no boundaries. At least there haven't been. So soldiers come back to grab her and take her back to the castle. Now, coincidentally, the next morning, you get summoned to the castle. You found out last night that your grandfather actually built the castle and built the dungeon underneath. So it seems like all the story beats are kind of starting to draw in together. And you end up setting off on this interesting little adventure that takes you across all sorts of just bizarre places. You see, Illusion of Gaia takes place in what would really today be described as basically an alt history of Earth. So at the very least, a similar location to Earth after some story beats happen. And you actually visit places that have real world correlations to them. Now, putting a time frame on this kind of difficult. It is still a somewhat fantasy world because this one obviously has magic among other things. But you do everything from visit Incan ruins to going to a bazaar where you actually see slavery happening, in not a positive way. Like one of your friends gets captured and is trying to be sold into slavery and you have to save them. You see characters actually die. This has a few characters that get killed off. Experience all sorts of hardships. Very shortly, hold on, fast forward us a little bit. We go to talk to the king, and he immediately asks us for a crystal ring that he didn't say anything about. Well, actually, he may have said something about bringing it with him, but we don't have it. And just because we don't have it, he assumes we've decided not to bring it to him and throws us in a prison cell. And his queen acts completely shocked that we even have the ability to address her. The cool thing about this prison cell sequence is it shows some stuff about this game that make it a little bit different. There's not really a whole lot you can do to actually accelerate this portion. You can go around, inspect the cell, and there are a couple points where you can interact that some of them won't appear until you've interacted with others, but it seems like it's at least partially time-based. Like no matter what you do, it's not going to accelerate the rate that you manage to get through the cell here. You have to spend a little bit of time in here before the game finally decides to let you move on by throwing a piece of bread down to you. So you eat and have to wait around a little bit more. It actually gives you a sense of being locked in this cell. There's no quick way to just break down the door and get out and move on. So there are points where the game interferes with the speed of the narrative to actually make you feel something about what the events are that are going on. And there's a lot of cool sequences kind of like this. There's a sequence later on in the game where you find yourself on a golden ship that's sailing across the ocean. And it seems weird because there's all sorts of living beings on it. And everything that you had encountered in the particular area you were in up until that point had been spirits. So after you do a handful of things, you flash forward just a little bit and then the ship is suddenly really dilapidated. And everyone that was alive before is now spirits. And that beautiful golden ship that you were on is actually a ruin, and you were just getting to see what it was like when it was in its pristine condition. But it has story beats like this all throughout the game. One of the cooler ones that happens much later in the game is you actually visit the Nazca lines, and those end up being a means of transporting you up into a whole dungeon system that's up in the sky, so like a sky fortress. So lots of weird little encounters that lead to what are the sort of coolest aspect of this game, and that's its dungeons. Right now, you're getting to go into the first experience you have is a tutorial dungeon. Now, this dungeon, yet again, it spells a couple things out to you, but it shows you the stuff that you were hinted at before. Like, this room deliberately has just a handful of enemies in it to encourage you to actually kill all of them to see one of the cooler features of this game. When you clear all the monsters out of an area, you get some sort of stat upgrade, be it health, defense, or attack. Now granted, those are the only real stat upgrades that you actually see, but it heavily motivates you to actually go through and kill everything in a room. Now, one thing I haven't encountered, and I don't know if this is just the emulator or me being really bad at the game before, but I remember back in the day, it seemed like if you left a room before you cleared everything, everything regenerated. It could be me misremembering. I've played through the game a couple times, and this is the first time I've really noticed this. And it could just be that I'm good enough now that I'm not dying nearly as often. But I'm pretty sure on death, stuff resets. But I don't know. It doesn't seem to be an issue now. So you can clear it out a little bit at a time. And if you do die, all the enemies do regenerate. But you can't, just to be clear on this, you can't re-clear all the enemies out of a room and get the stat upgrade again. Once you've gotten it once from that point out, you might as well just dodge around everything in the room to make your way back to where you were. But that is a cool aspect of the game. In order to get continues so that you can actually pick back up without resetting everything and go back to a closer point, the points that I'm picking up off of the enemies, those little gems there, like on screen, if you look up at the middle of the screen, there's a counter that goes up every time you pick those up. When you get 100, you basically get a continue. And that makes your last restore point just a little bit closer and keeps everything from regenerating. Now, in boss fights, you do start the boss fight over again, but they're still useful to have because they don't send you all the way back to your last save point. And save points are not thrown at you all over the place. The game is pretty generous with them, but not so generous that they don't feel scattered. Now, granted, on an emulator, you could just use save states, and that's a super effective way to go through it, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I really like emulators. But that being said, there's usually save places relatively close to important story beats or important encounters that actually do stand a chance to kill you. So, right now, he's escaping from the castle, but on the way, he's meeting a couple different characters to help him, and to be honest, you're also getting ready to learn one of the more, let's say, slightly frustrating aspects of this game. You see, the weapon that we're fighting with is a flute. The only other game I can think of where you actively use a flute is the Mystical Ninja series, and this is not like that. Those games, while they're super fun, and at some point I may pull up an emulator of them to play them, this one's just a bit more serious, where Mystical Ninja is a little bit more on the silly side. This guy is using also more of a Western flute rather than an Asian style flute. Also, unlike in those games, he can play the flute. In order to play the flute, you have to go into your inventory, equip the music note that has the specific song you want to play, and then you come back out of that menu, and every time you go to hit that button, something like this happens if you can play it. Now, while that is actually pretty cool, there is an issue with it, and that's that if it will actually let you play the song, it plays it all the way through every time you hit the button to play it. So, that sucks a little bit, but the number of times where you actually have to actively play your flute is not all that common. The only place where it gets a little bit concerning is if you're unsure whether or not you should be playing it in an area, and you have to go through and test out every song that you get, which is, it's not many, so it's not like it's wasting a ton of your time. It does take just a second. There's no canceling to get out of it, but whatever. Of all the complaints that I could have about this game, that's a relatively minor one. So, what is the big draw to keep going in this game? And what was it that really made me decide that I wanted to play it to begin with as a kid? Well, let's jump ahead and actually look at what happens in the actual first real dungeon. Because this one right now, like I said, it's the tutorial dungeon. It's really fleshed out and well built. Right now, it's showing you how to transform into one of your transformations that you'll stick with for most of the game, which is Friedan, and he's a Dark Knight. So boost your attack, boost your reach. But that transformation is not why I wanted to play the game as a kid. Why I wanted to play the game as a kid is something in particular that I was able to see on the back of the box. So let's jump forward and I'll show you. This is the end of the first major dungeon in the game. Your father has summoned you through some mystical means to go to this set of Incan ruins. And you have to go through the ruins after you've collected 2 statues from the nearby village and figure out your way to get to this point, place those statues, and then a wind will pick you up and carry you over here. By the way, you can go into what I'm getting ready to show you as Will or as Friedan. Friedan's the much better choice to do this with, though. But this is the thing that drew me in and made me actually want to play the game. Because on the back of the box at the video store, I could read the description of the game, see that it was an action RPG, and then see a screenshot of this exact screen with this guy. I saw this awesome looking giant demon popping up out of the ground that you were clearly supposed to fight, and thought, that looks really fun, because the one way to pull young me in was to have really cool boss fights, and that's something that I still really like today. It's hard to beat a really cool boss fight, and this game is packed full of them. And most of them aren't super straightforward. Like, I mean, it's not the most complex tactics in the world, but at the time, you gotta remember this is a Super Nintendo game. Everything had some quirks to it, a few little oddities here and there that you had to do to actually successfully kill that creature. And in this case, this dude, you had to wait for his eyes to actually be open and dodge his attacks. And then you could beat him really quickly. Now, I'm going to grab some footage from earlier on and throw it back in here just so I can talk to you a little bit more and tell you some of the other fun quirks about the game. So, no one that loves this game is unaware of this fact, but plenty of people that may just now be watching it probably don't know this. Illusion of Gaia was made by a company called Quintet. They made several really sort of super popular games from way back in the Super Nintendo era. If you remember watching the old game show on Nickelodeon where they would go and actually play some games on like an arcade machine, I think at the end of it they went through an obstacle course. One of the games that they could play was ActRaiser. Quintet made ActRaiser. They made ActRaiser 1 and 2. They made another game called Soul Blazer. And then came Illusion of Gaia. And after Illusion of Gaia, Terranigma. Now, why am I explaining this? The thing that Quintet did that was actually kind of interesting, while none of these games, other than the ones that were directly named, were actually sequels from each other, they actually have elements and nods back to the other ones. They're referred to as Easter eggs, but the thing is, if you really get to digging into these games, it seems like they're a little bit more than just Easter eggs. The example of that, during Illusion of Gaia, you can go through and collect these other little gems that you trade to this dude that calls himself Gem Trader. And as you give them to him, you get power-ups. There's all sorts of cool, fun things you get. When you give him the very last one, it actually opens up an optional dungeon. And the boss of that optional dungeon is the boss to Soul Blazer. So, or well, a boss in Soul Blazer. So it's a big reference back to Soul Blazer. In a way, it's sort of a canonical direct link to that. Well, when you go on to Terranigma, the helpful entity in this, Gaia, the thing in the Dark Zone, is at least seemingly the main villain of that game. And there's some things that may make you think that these are actually linked together. Like, it really does seem as if these are really meant to be spiritual sequels to one another, regardless of whether the developers actually acknowledge that or not. And it could just be that they liked maintaining certain themes from game to game. And cool, whatever. Either way, it has actually created a little bit of lore where people functionally treat Soul Blazer as the prequel to this game. And of course, the prequels to Soul Blazer is ActRaiser 1 and 2, and then the sequel to this game would be considered Terranigma. Interestingly, they actually do improve on each other. As they go through, you can see the developers getting better and better. And it's a shame that these games have been sort of lost to time, because if I recall correctly, and I could be wrong on, but it seems like the current speculation is that Square Enix owns Quintet's old library. There was never really much confirmation about this because apparently the president of the company just kind of vanished at a certain point. But Square Enix did release a remaster of ActRaiser, and since then people have been begging them to re-release Terranigma and Illusion of Gaia. Which, by the way, Illusion of Gaia, not terribly hard to get hold of if you actually want to get the physical game to play, but Terranigma is going to be a little bit of a challenge because it wasn't released in all regions, and the easiest way to play it generally is with an English patched ROM, although yada yada, shouldn't download pirated games, blah blah blah, but this is one of those instances where getting a hold of the game is so hard that you really don't have much of a choice. And to be completely blunt, if you got sued by this, or sued for downloading it and playing it, at least then you'd know who the current rights holder is, because no one else seems to be aware. So more than likely you would just get a notice from them saying, hey, could you delete this? We're planning on doing something with it. But I don't know. This was one of the best games that came out for the Super Nintendo. And it's the only game that I can think of that came out that had even a passing resemblance to the same sort of style that Zelda was doing. And it's a shame that this didn't really pop off and that their games really didn't take off better than what they did, because this company could have easily been someone to produce stuff to rival Nintendo. And Nintendo desperately needs some sort of competition to push them to actually do better. I mean, we see how much they're struggling right now to try to get rid of competition in the form of suing Pocket Power rather than actually trying to make Pokemon better. So, I don't know. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. Anyway, Illusion of Gaia is a top tier game. Definitely recommend checking it out. And what I've actually decided I'm going to do is, whenever I feel the urge to play it, I'm going to pop on stream, play it on there, and I'll just put up the uploads of the full dungeons at that time. I cut a lot out of this video. This video was at least an hour's worth of gameplay, but there was a ton of story in between each of the dungeons. And there is a bunch of story to this game. It is as much role-playing as it is game. The story is not neglected and thrown off to the side. It actually is kind of complex to follow at certain parts. There's some really cool aspects to it. Like there's a part where you get stranded on a little raft with one of the other characters for seemingly several days, and it shows them getting more and more desperate as the days go and struggling to really survive for the first little bit until they narrow a few things down. So it doesn't shy away from actually approaching some really interesting themes, even considering the fact that the characters are supposed to be kids, which, let's just be honest, most of the characters in older games are kids because they were, keeping in mind they were developing for supposedly a kid audience. I don't know, stuff like this sort of gives you the peek at the idea that in the future games are going to be for more than just children. But anyway, those are my thoughts on this. I'll leave you off showing you what happens after you do actually manage to beat the giant red-faced demon. So, our red-faced friend disappeared, and as the game does when you're transitioning out of areas, it forces you back to Will, because Will is the main character, not the Dark Knight or the other transformation that you get later. You walk up here, and there's a giant hole in the ground. Being the exploring young man that you are, you just jump down in the hole. Then you fall for seemingly an incredibly long time before landing on the gold Inca ship that I mentioned before. Alright everyone, remember, if I can beat it, so can you, and I'll see you streaming on this one. Good night.